Okay, I think we'll start. So let's start. First of all, welcome everybody. Very glad you could come. And this lecture is being, as you know, hosted by March Memorial Library. If you're not a member of March Memorial Library, you really should be. It's a wonderful institution, and if you don't know about it, we can send you a lot of information, but it's very, very well worth joining. And you will get, if you join, a copy of our theoretical journal, which would normally cost you £10 for free. And it's a very, very good journal. It's called Theory and Struggle, and that's what we're all about. And that's what March Memorial Library is about. My name's Mary Davis. I'm the secretary of the library, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to what I think is going to be a very important and a very good meeting tonight. We celebrate lots of a lot of things in this library, but we are now today, well, not actually, it's not this day, but we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of a very, very important event, the 1971 TUC and the 1971 struggle against the Industrial Relations Act. And actually, I think it is today. It's in September, wasn't it? In 1971, and we are in September. So 50 years ago, possibly today, the Trade Union Congress voted to defy a Conservative government. In fact, in 1974, we actually defeated a Conservative government, but this was the prelude to that. It instructed all unions to refuse to implement the Tories Industrial Relations Act and to resist its restrictions on the right to strike. Within a year, this defiance climaxed with the declaration of a general strike and resulted in the abandonment of the legislation. I think we can learn an awful lot from that. So we've got two fantastic speakers tonight who I know are going to fill you in both in terms of the history, but also in terms of what exists today and how we can fight the fact that we still have got an appalling load of anti-union legislation, because of course the Tories learned from what they did, and I'm sure you'll hear this. They tried to do it all at once, and then Thatcher did it in 12, well, I think 12, but John will correct me, 12 acts of Parliament. So our two speakers are Lord John Hendy QC, who is a trustee of our library, and I'm sure is very well known to all of you, and equally well known is Carolyn Jones, who is the director of the Institute of Employment Rights. Both of them, of course, are involved in the Institute of Employment Rights. So I'm going to ask John to speak first, followed then by Carolyn, and then we'll have a discussion, and the speakers can reply. So John Hendy, please, very pleased to welcome you, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Mary. I'm really the hors d'oeuvre to Carolyn, who's the main course here, because she's going to speak about the defeat of the Industrial Relations Act. And what I'd like to do is just say something about why the Industrial Relations Act was introduced when it was, and why it was introduced in the form in which it was, and lay out some background factors about the economy and the trade union movement at the time. It's always interesting when you're talking about history, and I see several old friends here who, like me, actually lived through this and went on the demonstrations against the Kill the Bill in 1969 and 1970, and went to the National Industrial Relations Court and heard the cases brought under the Industrial Relations Act. So I don't want to speak much about the Act itself, but it's an interesting reflection that of nearly every single provision introduced by the Industrial Relations Act, which was subsequently defeated, has since been brought in by the raft of legislation of Thatcher and Major. I count 7 acts of Parliament rather than 12, Mary, but it is quite true that there were little bits and pieces here and there. And of course, the process of adding to the restrictions on trade union has continued right up to 2016 with the Trade Union Act. And now next Tuesday in the House of Lords, we'll be debating the Police Crime and Sentencing bill, which introduces yet further restrictions on picketing, although that doesn't seem to have sunk in very widely within the trade union movement. But that's what it's all about, or part of it is all about. So the first thing to mention is of course that the act was preceded by media attacks on the trade unions, but then this has been common right through from the beginnings of the 18th century onwards. Trade unions and trade unionism has been attacked, sometimes more vehemently than others, particularly the coverage of the general strike in 1926 and so on. But there was clearly a campaign by the media, who, as today, deeply embedded with the state and the Tory government and so on. But the lines of attack are not quite the same as they are now. The argument then was that trade unions were too strong and were usurping some of the functions of democratic government, that shop stewards were causing agitation and unrest amongst what would otherwise be loyal, contented and obedient workers, and that fomented strikes which were occurring all over the country, and that these strikes are the principal cause of the economic problems of today. Now, not even the Tories can argue that now, with the state of or the weakened state of the trade unions, but those were the arguments then. And what happened was that the Tories picked up this in a sort of intellectual fashion by publishing a document called Fair Deal at Work in 1967, which was shortly before the publication of the Donovan Report on Industrial Relations, which was initiated by the Wilson government in 1968, where it published the report in 1968. It's actually started its work in 1966. Tories also published another important document called A Giant's Strength, some thoughts on the constitutional and legal position of trade unions in England. And the campaign fought by the Tories through the popular media and through this more intellectual approach in these pamphlets was definitely influential on the Wilson government, although it was quite a progressive government compared to new Labour governments under Blair. It was nevertheless influential. And one of the big preoccupations of the media was inflation. And the argument was that wage rises were the principal cause of inflation. Of course, it's economic bollocks, to use the technical expression. There's no basis for it at all, but that was the argument of the time. We still see hints of that argument today as we emerge from the pandemic. The economic backdrop was that in the 1960s, Britain had been gradually losing its share of export markets since the 1950s. Exported goods suffered from overvaluation of sterling. There was a marked lack of investment in manufacturing, and Japan, Germany, France, and Italy, which had all suffered much greater damage during the war, invested much more heavily, particularly through the state, in physical infrastructure and on modern production methods, modern machinery, and in particular in research and development. But British governments didn't seem to do that. And Wilson's speech in 1963 about Britain being forged in the white heat of technological change was likewise just nonsense. It was a lovely thought, but it wasn't in fact true, and it wasn't where capitalists were putting their money in the United Kingdom then. This, of course, was before the great advance of globalization. From the 1980s, Britain still had the vestiges of an empire, or at least a commonwealth at the time. But the fact was that the standard of living of British people did increase consistently. The average wage in real terms rose by about 40% between 1950 and 1966. And the elements of planning and the mixed Keynesian economy that Attlee had introduced remained more or less conventional policy for 35 years after the war, until Thatcher's election in 1979. But though incomes in Britain rose, Britain was not a high wage economy. And the instinct of British capitalism was to exploit modest wage rates rather than to invest in efficiency. And of course, that tendency is still characteristic of the British economy. Capital relies on cheap labor in Britain in preference to investment in efficiency and productivity, which is one of the reasons why Britain's got the almost, I think, the lowest rate of productivity in the OECD. Unemployment was not particularly significant in the 1960s and 1970s. It was about 1.5% to 2% up to about 1967, and grew to around 3.7% by 1972. So unemployment wasn't really a factor. It was a near full employment economy. Now, inflation was beginning to be a problem, but at the time that the Industrial Relations Act was introduced, it wasn't a particularly significant problem. Inflation had been below not 5% in the 1950s and most of the 1960s. And by 1970, it was still only just over 5%. So the argument that inflation was a major constraint on British industry was, as I say, complete nonsense. Nevertheless, the Wilson government bought into the myth and attempted voluntary wage restraint, which had little impact on the unions, and in 1966 introduced a Prices and Wages Act with a national wage freeze for the second half of 1966, and that caused a major rift with the labour movement, because I move on. It's true that real earnings rose faster than prices through the period, but that was a reflection of the bargaining power on the part of workers and unions, and was a principal component in increasing the wage share of workers. Wage share is what the economists call the share of gross domestic product, which goes in wages rather than in profits. And what we see over the period is that wage share in the United Kingdom averaged about 59% of GDP in the 1950s and 1960s. In other words, just under 60% of GDP went in wages, and just over 40% went in profits. And that slowly increased to a peak of 65.5% in wages in 1974. And 1975, 1976 are in fact the most egalitarian years in the whole of British history. Never before, never since have wages taken such a high percentage of GDP. And what happened after that was that wage share fell from that high point of just under 66% and fell to what it is now, is around 49%. So what's happened over the last 40 years is that wage share has declined to the extent that more than half of GDP is in profits and less than half in wages. And that is what has produced the massive inequality in Britain. And of course, amongst the percentage which is distributed to those who are not wage earners, there is a marked inequality as well, as you know, between the lower percentiles and the higher percentiles. So that I think is a very, very significant factor when you look at when you ask the question, why was the Industrial Relations Act introduced in 1971? It is because capital decided that it was not getting a big enough share of the cake and that the workers were getting too much. And of course, this is when you read the publications of the Tory party and so on, it's never put in those crude terms. It's masked by all the sort of neoliberal ideology that you can see analysed in the theoretical books on the subject. But that is what really lay behind this. And of course, it's one of the paradoxes of capitalism that increased wages also increase demand for goods and services, which drives a capitalist economy. The fact is that British capital rejected the concept of a high wage, high demand economy, which was adopted in the Nordic countries, and preferred the idea of depressing wages as far as it was possible to do. And that involved destroying the collective power of trade unions and workers. I should just say a word about collective bargaining at the time. Collective bargaining coverage is actually quite difficult to determine, but so far as it can be seen, from the beginning of the Second World War, when collective bargaining was actively promoted, collective bargaining or the promotion of collective bargaining had been bipartisan government policy since the beginning of the 20th century, but it was used as a real tool of production, war production, during the Second World War. And by the beginning of the Second World War, about 50% of British workers were covered by a collective agreement. By 1950, 5 years after the end of the war, that coverage had risen to around 70% and remained relatively stable until it began to rise again in the second half of the 1960s. So by 1970, coverage was about 78% of the workforce. About 1975, it had risen to a peak of 85% of British workers. So more than 8 out of 10 workers was covered by a collective agreement negotiated on their behalf by a trade union. Not that they necessarily were members of that trade union, but they got the benefit of that collective bargaining. And you can see from those figures that the increase in collective bargaining coverage is very close to the ascent of wage share over a similar period. Both peaked in the late 1960s. late 1970s. So it was clear that the destruction of collective bargaining was an essential tool in reducing workers' wage share and thus boosting profit share. Of course, well, Cad may well mention what's happened to collective bargaining coverage in the last 40 years, which is an absolute tragedy. Just one last thing about collective bargaining then, and it's this, that most of that collective bargaining coverage was achieved by sectoral collective bargaining. That's to say, collective bargaining sector by sector of the economy. In fact, in 1970, it's estimated that only 9% of workers were covered by enterprise bargaining. And from that, you can see why it is that enterprise bargaining is so favoured by the UK state and, of course, in particular, the US state, because actually enterprise bargaining is not successful in raising the living standards of the working class as a whole. It's got to be sectoral collective bargaining to have that impact. So the trade union movement followed collective bargaining coverage. There is a loose association between the two. By 1979, which is of course well after our period, trade union membership had peaked at 13.2 million members, after which it fell. But of course, the important thing is that what provokes most people to join a trade union, not all the political activists I see in the virtual room today, but most ordinary people join trade unions in order to get the benefit of collective bargaining. That, of course, is the very function of trade unions. And if trade unions are denied the opportunity to bargain collectively, a lot of people, particularly when there's heavy pressure on wages, as there is at the moment, decide to spend what they would have spent on union subscriptions on living costs. But just one other feature in relation to trade union membership, and that is that in 1961 there were 90,000 shop stewards, which had risen to 175,000 by 1968. So you can see there why the Tories thought that shop stewards were a major problem. I have to say that I think if you read the evidence to the Donovan Commission, that some of the leaderships of the trade unions fell into that trap as well, because they appeared to accept that power should be taken away from shop stewards and exercised by the leadership of trade unions. But actually, it was the power of shop stewards which enabled collective bargaining to be successful on a sectoral level, because, of course, of the threat of industrial action. And when you look at the industrial action figures, you do see that the incidence of strikes in the period leading up to the Act of 1971 was significant, a rising incidence with a loss of an ever-increasing number of days. Nothing compared to the general strike of 1926 or the miners' strike of 1984-5, or even the public sector dispute in 1979, but still a rising figure which enabled the media to portray strikes as one of the great evils that had to be suppressed. Of course, it was simply an expedient for attacking the means by which workers attempted to extract through collective bargaining a greater share of the fruits of surplus value that they created. Now, I haven't spoken much about the Donovan Commission from 1966 to 1968. We can discuss that if we need to afterwards. But it was on the back of that, of course, that the Labour Party, susceptible to media pressure, introduced Barbara Castle's white paper in place of strife. Now, that was a terrible, terrible mistake, because it opened the door to the Tories to say, we don't agree with this white paper, we'll introduce a white paper of our own. And of course, that's exactly what they did. In fact, there was a major dispute between the Labour government and the Labour movement, as a result of which Barbara Castle's white paper had to be rewritten. There was a special Congress of the TUC in June 1969, and the Labour government introduced an industrial relations bill on the 29th of April 1970, which was a much watered down version. But the bill was doomed, because on the 2nd of July 1970, there was a general election, and Heath's Conservative Party won the election, partly on the basis of a campaign claiming that Labour was unable to control the unions because of the success that the unions had in blocking in place of strife. Well, Heath's next step on the 1st of December of 1970 was to introduce the Tory Industrial Relations Bill, presented to Parliament by the Minister of Labour of the time, Robert Carr, which gained the royal assent on the 5th of August 1971. And I'm going to leave it there for Cad to explain what the Labour movement did about that.
Well, thank you, John. That's excellent background to what Cad is going to say, and I think it's important that it was the strength of the movement that really always and often does ensure that that capital wants to try and ensure that strength is broken. So, Cad, it's thank you very much, John. Great, Cad, over to you.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks, John. It's always hard to follow John, but I'll try. I don't know what kind of hors d'oeuvres he has in his house, but that was more of a main meal, I would say, but I will follow it up with some afters. So first, apologies to those like Mary who know better than me all that I will say this evening. In fact, I thought you were going to say it in your introduction, Mary. Similarly, I apologise to those new to the issue. If I skip too fast through some of the historic events, it's difficult line to tread now on how to pitch the discussion. It's an excellent time, though, to remember the past victories and to review the lessons we can learn today. Without a doubt, the years 1970 to 1974 saw some of the most famous moments of post-war working class history. It was a period that joined the dots between the political, the economic and the industrial struggles impacting on the lives of working class. Unsurprisingly, it was also the years, as John just said, when trade union numbers peaked. And it was communists, I have to say, that were at the heart and the head of the struggles that followed. As John has outlined, the 1971 Congress voted to defy the Conservative government's Industrial Relations Act, but it was the run-up to that 1971 Congress decision that was decisive. Unions were fighting back against incomes policy, against anti-trade union legislation, and against the imprisonment of activists, posties, bus drivers, manufacturing workers. The industrial wing of the labour movement was on the move, and the aim of the Tories in its 1970 Industrial Relations Bill was to restrict that movement of the trade unions. Bert Ramilson, who was at the time the industrial organiser of the CPB, characterised the bill as the most vicious piece of politically motivated class legislation since the Combination Acts of 1800s. And Bert, working closely with Kevin Halpin, who was the leader of the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions, now I should say the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom, they called for a mobilisation of rank and file shop stewards against the bill. They argued that it would be mass action on the streets and not a propaganda exercise by the TUC that would win the day. It should point out that the TUC published a publication called Reason, which really got the troops going, I'm sure. And the movement responded to the party's call for action. Massive demonstrations took place around the country, too many to talk about here. In Wolverhampton, there were 20,000 out on the streets. In Oxford, strike action led to suspension of 5 British Leyland sites. In March 1971, 100,000 took to the streets of London. And it was estimated that 1.5 million workers took part in unofficial day of protest against the bill. Those strike actions created an atmosphere of fight back that unions took into a special TUC Congress in Croydon in March 1971. At that Congress, it was agreed that affiliated unions should not register when the 1970 Tory bill became law. And to maintain that momentum, and I'm not trusting the TUC, and to ensure that the rank and file were engaged and active in the battle, the Liaison Committee held its own conference in June 1971, attended by 1,200 delegates from 500 union branches, and that conference called for strike action if any trade unionist was imprisoned. So, when Bernie Steer and Vic Turner, leaders of the dockers, were threatened with prison for refusing to attend the new court, the National Industrial Labour Relations Court, the movement was ready, and on that occasion, the state backed off. That was swiftly followed by further action at the docks and the arrest of the Pentonville Five in July 1972, and another major dispute in the history of our movement. That sparked a massive rank and file demand for the immediate release of the dockers. Pressure from below and the solidarity of groups of workers, both here and abroad, culminated in the TUC General Council calling for a one-day general strike. Within 5 days, the state caved in. The doors to the prisons were opened and the dockers were released on the 26th of July. Victory in action, I'm sure we can see. But it wasn't just dockers who had brushes with the state during that period. We couldn't discuss this period without mentioning the workers in the Upper Clyde shipyards. It was a different issue. It was different tactics, but it was the same class-based battle. At the UCS, their action was over job losses. Bosses were proposing to liquidate the yard and sell the site for redevelopment. The workers, on the other hand, refused to accept that the yards couldn't be made profitable, and in June 1971 began a work-in to stop the loss of 6,000 jobs. Again, the movement collectively responded, raising £485,000 to pay the wages. Within 8 months, the Tories had caved in. The yard was saved, now becoming Govan Shipbuilders, and it was not only saved, but attracted 35 million of government investment into the yards. Talk of the site being unprofitable disappeared at that point, helping to highlight that if you invest in plant and if you invest in people, then you get returns. It's as simple, like John just said, it makes sense. Importantly, that action by the UCS highlighted the idea of the right to work, an idea that led to 57 sit-ins in the months that followed. No wonder unemployment was so low during those years. People were refusing to accept that sites were unprofitable and had to close. But still, the Tories, or because of that, the Tories blundered on, and the Industrial Relations Bill became an act in August 1971. The following month, as discussed by John, the 1971 TUC endorsed the decision of the Croydon Conference not to register under the Act, and went as far as to give full support to the rise in industrial action being taken by unions. Most students didn't register on pain of expulsion from the TUC. I think out of 469 unions, only 30 unions registered under the Act, and most of those registering unions were suspended from the TUC. But so most unions did not right. Oh yeah, so the government, with all of this activity, decided it couldn't enforce the Act, and the legislation was shelved. But it wasn't long before the Act was taken off the shelf again and dusted down in response to pay claims. Step forward the miners. Still stung by the failure of their pay policies and inability to enforce the Industrial Relations Bill, the government put pressure on the National Coal Board to resist an 8% pay claim from the miners, leading to a national coal strike in January 1972, the first since 1926. 20,000 flying pickets and the support of 15,000 engineers workers later, and the battle was won. Strikes closed down 14 power stations, a state of emergency was imposed, and Heath, with nowhere else to go, set up a committee of inquiry to dig himself out of the hole the Tories had dug. The commission recommended large pay increases for the miners, another historic victory, helped along by the solidarity action of power workers and others. Other losses for the NERC included unions like the engineers refusing to pay fines imposed for contempt of court. It was suggested, and I'm sure John will know more about that, it was suggested in some cases employers actually paid the fines to avoid strikes. Whatever the truth, the union stand was vindicated and the authority of the NERC was fatally damaged, and within weeks, I believe, it was wound up. But it wasn't long before economic and political attacks on workers led to a new round of industrial action. Phase 3 of Heath's pay restraint policy came into force in autumn 1973. It was the latest in a series of efforts by the ruling class to do away with collective bargaining. Once again, it was proposed that state-regulated wages should be used to solve the chronic and cyclical crisis of capitalism at the expense of the working class. Consider the similarities with today's austerity-led pay freezes. Again, the class nature of the legislation being forced on a majority by a minority shone through. It was undemocratic and attacked the very reasons of trade unions, the ability to negotiate the terms and conditions of their members. There's a picture I have on my Twitter feed that says, when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. Workers did then and have now the right to resist blatantly class-biased legislation, and they did. And once again, the miners led the way. Threatened with a second miners' strike, Heath went to the polls in 1974 with his Who Runs Britain general election campaign. Not the Tories was the answer from the electorate. Labour won, but by a very small majority. And we might want to discuss why the result was so close, given the strength of the trade union movement and the hatred of the Tories. Suffice to say, as John suggested, the press played a big part in that election, with a virulent anti-trade union and Red Scare anti-communist campaign. Nevertheless, with Labour in power, the restrictions in phase 3 of the Tory incomes policy were lifted, the miners were awarded a good pay increase, and another victory was achieved. But more than that, that strike, as Mary suggested in the beginning, and the combination of the numerous strikes over the previous year had effectively brought down an elected government. The gains made by the left during that period were reflected in the Labour government's initial programme. Both the Industrial Relations Act and the Prices and Incomes Act were repealed. Collective bargaining was restored, public ownership extended, and promises made on the redistribution of wealth and power. As we know, Labour eventually dropped its election promises and reverted to its traditional role of managing capitalist economy in the face of economic troubles. Troubles, by the way, caused not by overpowerful unions or over-generous pay brackets, as suggested by the media, but by external forces. The social contract, or contract as Bert Ramilson called it, was introduced, supported by the TUC in 1975. Collective bargaining was once again weakened and wage restraint demanded in return for price control. When prices began to rise and the contract became apparent for what it was, the result was the so-called winter of discontent. This time the state was ready. 5 years after the disastrous contract, Thatcher was elected to power, and a 20-year counter-offensive against the working class began. But despite the 1979 result, and I know I'm going a little out of the era here, but despite that result, we should still celebrate the victories of the Labour movement during that period and say, so what can we learn? Well, first, the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions was determined to work not just with left-leaning trade union leaders, but with the rank and file. And that was fundamental in stimulating and coordinating militant actions and policies. One without the other doesn't work. All leaders and no troops doesn't deliver, but uniting both together creates a strong and effective force. That's the first lesson we can learn from those disputes. Second, extra parliamentary activity from rank and file agitation against employers and government policies is essential. In today's world, strikes, solidarity action and picketing are more tightly controlled due to Thatcher's step-by-step legislation. Similarly, the Tory majority and the useless Labour Party means waiting on Parliament is a non-starter. But other actions and strategies can be developed. The issues of pay restraint, job losses, fire and rehire tactics remain with us, and anger is rising at the growing inequality in our society that John outlined. Extra parliamentary left unity through class struggle and building alliances will be crucial in the years ahead. The People's Assembly Against Austerity and the CP's Fight Back Against Unemployment campaign are timely and crucial in that respect. Third lesson, the importance of the actions taken by so many union members was that they highlighted the link between government policy, workers' rights and living standards. It provided an opportunity to show workers the nature of the state in a class society. The reformist theory that the British state is somehow neutral or non-political or above class was wrong then, and it's wrong now. Marxist education, of course, on class and state power highlights the link between government policies and workers' problems and helps explain why workers are continually asked to pay for the failings of capitalism and the ruling class. The government's latest move to make workers pay for years of underinvestment in the NHS is a good example of aiming to make workers pay for capitalism's failure while the rich get richer. Let's hope that Johnson's nick is resisted as much as Heath's near with similar amount of political damage. We also need to keep exposing the lies uttered by the Tories. When the Tories claim to be making the UK the best place to work, we need to remind them that the UK workers work longest hours, lowest pay, shortest holidays and worst pensions in Europe, and that's before the triple lock is abandoned. And fourth and final lesson is that we must remain vigilant against attacks on trade unions while pushing for improvements in the current framework of rights and protections. John mentioned the need for sectoral collective bargaining, which has dropped from the 85% figure that he quoted down to as little as 20%. Now, that's not by accident. That is political choice and decision by our government, and we need the same kind of commitment to bring it back again. Unfortunately, we didn't get the government we wanted last time. Had we, then the work done by John and Keith and the Institute would now be implemented, and we would be reintroducing sectoral collective bargaining, which would do an awful lot to do away with a lot of the problems that we're facing today. So that's arguing for better rights. Just a couple of examples of attacks we need to watch against. The Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, as mentioned by John, contains massive threats to the right to protest and to picket, based on spurious arguments about intimidation caused by noise levels and by numbers. And if that reminds you of the Shrewsbury pickets, it should, and it should be a bigger campaign against that particular bill. The state, it seems to me, is adding to its armoury because they fear a post-COVID backlash. And as in the past, If the state can say actions by workers are unlawful, those of our leaders who are hung up on the sanctity of law, as Bert Ramilson noted, are liable to be divided in their support of workers. The second example of new attacks is the powers given to the certification officer to fine and bankrupt unions is an administrative attack not dissimilar to the fines and threats contained in the Industrial Relations Act. The aim is to frighten unions and to silence into silent obedience. Finally, whilst some look forward to what's promised in the employment bill might offer, I feel more trepidation about that, about what it will threaten. We need to be ready to resist and to ensure that the TUC is prepared to fight. If not, I fear that crumbs from the table, like for instance, not enacting the powers of the certification officer, will be traded for yet more devastating attacks on unions. No trades, no dithering, no union bartering for the interests of their members. A united response, as we know from our past, is what delivers. So we need to approach the official 2021 TUC with vigilance and determination. COVID has shone a light on the inadequacies of our laws, our economy and our government. People have given loads during this pandemic and demand a better post-pandemic world. At the moment, we have sympathy as a movement. We've got support for the actions that we've taken and shortages. They're all on our side. In other words, we have some power. Global capitalism increasingly relies on supply chains that are prone to vulnerabilities and choke points, as they call them. That gives unions structural power and leverage power. So let's learn from our past and use that power to fight for our future. Cheers.
Oh, that was brilliant, Cad. Thank you very, very much. And if we could, we would all be, both of you, I think you've really, what you've done is to give us a reminder for those who were actually there, like me and Anita, because we're, you know, yes, that shows how old we are. But I think it's very, very important for those who weren't there that this is part of our history that has to be told. What I just want to thank you both so much, because you've opened a really important and uncovered a chapter of our history, which I don't think is understood nearly enough, and it is inspirational actually. So because there are, I can see everybody on the screen, I'm going to, people who want to either make a comment or ask a question, if you just want to put your hand up, your yellow hand probably would be best, because I can't see your faces. So please, Mark, you got your hand up, so over to you.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks both for the really fascinating talk. As an activist, I was very young actually in 1971, probably too young to really have much of an opinion then. But I did want to say something about the current day, and it is a question. I'll phrase it as a question. I'm a mental health worker in Greater Manchester and a Unison activist, and we're having a meeting in the next couple of days. And the title of the meeting is, how do we respond to our members who are refusing to take the vaccination? And it was one of those questions when I first read it, I thought, oh, I know the answer to this, but the more I think I need to get a more rounded view of what my response as a socialist is. I can see that in social care, health and social care, we have a lot of female workers, and probably quite a few younger female workers as well. Since we know this vaccine has not been tested, we don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. My opinion is that we support them to refuse, and we even though, you know, this, it could be quite a dangerous thing. So, I mean, the stakes seem to be quite high. I'm just curious about what other people think. And you know, what would Marx say? What the socialists say about this issue? Sorry to drop that one on you, but
yeah, thank you. I think probably most of the comments, certainly we need to look at that, but should be around what we've heard, which is on the 1971 50th anniversary. Anita, you're next. Anita was there. No, we can't hear you, Anita. Put your unmute. You need to unmute. I'll do it for you.
I am unmuted, aren't I?
Right,
Now?
go on.
Yeah. So I need to preface my remarks that, in fact, I didn't meet Kevin till September 73. So
you can help him. We're talking about people don't
yes.
know Anita yet.
Well, I said I was Anita Halpin, but you didn't hear me. But then, I mean, I heard the endless stories and would recommend his book and various things that have been written since. I suppose the key point was, which was a big contest, and this is only things that I learned afterwards, after I met him. But at the formation of the liaison committee, it made exactly the decision, Bert and the comrades made the decision that it did need both leaders and workers. I mean, you couldn't have one, you needed troops, but you also needed a few generals or colonels or whatever. I mean, the point that Cad was making. And this used to be a thorn in the side of the Trots, who always used this argument to try and break up liaison committee conferences on the basis that any elected leadership, however they have been elected, including by maybe their own members from the ultra left, the minute they get into power, they're immediately corrupt, because all leaderships are corrupt. And that is the real problem that we have of trying to work and promote left-led unions as well as unions with a strong left and work with them. So jumping forward rapidly, looking at this year's TUC final agenda, which is a much shorter version with debating time and Keith Starmer and all the prize acts. So there's 9.5 hours of debate over 2.5 days, a day less, and 12 hours less debate than in 91. Yeah. And therefore, there are lots of mega composites, which means lowest common denominator, all the general secretaries in their grey suits are going to get in, there's no debate. But there is one very interesting motion that I hope will be raised at the Morningstar Fringe meeting, is the one from A New Deal for All Workers from the CWU, and I can't find it, but actually that makes a specific demand, as does a motion from the PCS, for coordinated action in one way or another, which was exactly what the TUC, going way, way back after the Wembley Special Conference, had to agree did work. And we spent a long time trying to convince them that it can work again. So I really can't find it now, but that is there. It is very good. And as a motion, and because it's a large union, and I'm sure they will actually get in to speak. So shorter time, the TUC is going to be even more managed this year. But I'd like to thank Cad very much, and John for setting the scene, and Cad showing what could be done, and now convincing us in the post-pandemic, hopefully, country that we're going to be in, that we can actually win again.
Thank you, Anita. Luci.
So thank you very much for the lesson in history. I knew very little of this. It's very interesting to learn more. What I'm wondering is, like, it seems that in 71, 72, a large part of why the working class won that particular battle was some amount of unity, at least to some extent, around the TUC. Nowadays, at least some or several of the more radical active unions, like the IWGB that I'm a member of, are explicitly against the TUC, explicitly independent of any sort of national cross-union body, or and a lot of members are completely ignorant that these structures even exist. However, conditions are worsening and people are getting radicalized and joining unions. So, like, besides telling people about working class history that do join these unions, what else can and should we try to do, since the conditions of how we're organized now are quite different?
Very good question, thank you. Anybody else want to either ask something or say something? If not, I'm going to ask Cad and John if they'd like to take up some of those points or questions. John, would you like to start? John, would you?
You're on mute.
Unmute.
Yes, sorry, yeah. I don't really want to talk about compulsory vaccination, thanks.
Okay.
I'm not sure that the legal advice would be particularly helpful on that subject. But and Anita raised the question of the TUC agenda this year. I agree with that. I don't think it's going to be a terribly productive TUC, both because of its shortened form and because of the situation that the Labour movement is in. And we've got a government that really is exploiting its power without inhibition. It's true that they're not very strategic about it, but nevertheless there are people there who are exploiting their power. They are going to activate the power of the CO to impose fines. That is on the cards. They're not going to introduce an employment bill, at least for the next year or so, because they don't want to even give a shadow of any succor to employee or to workers at all. And they are going to impose these restrictions on the right to protest, demonstrate and picket in the police crime and sentencing bill. So they are completely ruthless. I've intervened in the House of Lords 3 times this week, Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, each time asking a question about collective bargaining. And the government just couldn't care less. I mean, absolutely, totally indifferent to worker representation at all, or democracy or the rule of law. So we've got a completely ruthless government. But I do agree with Anita that a CWU initiative on a new deal for workers is very important. It's vital that we do bring home to workers what is needed, and the other side of that coin is how bad the situation is, because people get used to the situation. That's the thing. I mean, people know that they haven't got enough money to put food on the table and pay the rent and so on, but they get used to the feelings of powerlessness. And it's very important that we bring home that power is possible and solidarity is possible. So in answer to Luce's a question, I think the key thing is coordination. It's unfortunate that the IWGB has not been admitted to the TUC and United Voices of the World and so on. That's really, something's got to be done about that. These are unions that are young, full of enthusiasm and lots of initiative and lateral thinking about how to progress disputes and do the best for members and so on, and in particular high rates of membership participation in the determination of policy, strategy and tactics, which is a feature which can't be said of all the unions in Britain today, can it? So I think coordination is key, and I think the PCS, in asking for coordinated action in the public sector is setting the way. Coordination is not easy, particularly because of the anti-union legislation, but it is possible. And I think that's the way. And as Cad mentioned earlier, let's not underestimate the power of anger amongst working class people. People know that they're not being treated fairly, and they are very, very angry about the situation, not perhaps for them, but for the way that they see their parents being treated or their children being treated. They know it's not right. They're angry. They want something to be done. And the final thing I would say is that trade unions have got to also adapt to the modern situation in broadening their view from strictly the workplace. We need to get back to people working across campaigns, coordinating across campaigns, the battle for the renters, the battle against food banks and all the rest of it. All these things are associated, aren't they? All together. And unions are really the only force that the working class have got. That's the reality, particularly with the Labour Party in its current state. It's only the unions that can do something about this. So they need to work more broadly. I'd like to see a greater role for the trades councils myself, because that is a way of acting at community level and taking up local campaigns which are broader than simply workplace issues.
Thanks very much, John. Cad, perhaps your comments, and perhaps you'd also like to take up the point that Simon has asked about removing the right to strike of groups such as essential workers. Could there be more to come? So, Cad, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So looking back, we're not here to talk about vaccination, but I would say that there is a role. I do think that there's a role for the state to play in keeping places safe. You know, I'm all in favour of seatbelts. I'm not a libertarian who says that the state shouldn't interfere in people's lives. On the other hand, they didn't interfere when company after company after company were ignoring the health and safety legislation that is already exists to protect workers in their workplace or by the required PPE. So, you know, it takes its pick about when it tries to help out and when it doesn't. There are other things that can keep place. You know, if they hadn't dumped people in care homes, then you wouldn't have had all those deaths. So I'm not going to the wire on that one, but I think it's not just about vaccinations. There are other things that can be done to keep people safe throughout. To Anita, yeah, I've put a link in the chat box to both Kevin's autobiography, Memories and Memoirs of a Militant. I also really recommend a political biography of Bert Ramilton by Roger Seifert and Tom Sibley. I'm sure the library has both of them, so that's another reason to join if you haven't already. And yeah, bringing unions together, it's about broad lefts, and both Bert and Kevin were very good in the leadership of developing broad lefts within trade unions. So some of them are much more left than others, some of them were. Ken Gill was very good at it as well. He brought the left of the General Council together to make sure that they went into TUC meetings with a line that they could all agree upon. And yeah, the CWU and the PCS are two of our leading unions that push the agenda continuously. So all support for them. In fact, I think the Morning Star has a fringe meeting at the TUC on the New Deal for Workers, which both Dave Ward and John are speaking at on Tuesday afternoon. So try and log into that if you can. Ruchi, how do we get, it's quite right that many people don't know exist. Many younger people don't know what trade unions are. They haven't really been in their life since 1979, given the decline of trade union. And who would join a union if you can't go on strike, if you can't have your union represent you you're in the workplace. If you can't have a union negotiate your terms and conditions, what is the point? It's a chicken and egg situation, and that's what we need to do something about. As we said, the more actions that take place, the more it raises people's consciousness and shows them where the real issue is. It's not in the workers, it's not in high wages, it's not in overpowerful unions. It is the ruling class who are squashing people all of the time. What was going to say? There are things that you do. For instance, we're going to the Diggers Festival this Saturday, which brings together people to celebrate past struggles of the trade union movement. Just getting people along to that. They might come along to hear a band, or or to see a particular speaker. But whatever you do, if we're involved in those events, it makes people aware of our history. And I agree that the increasing the work of trades councils is important. I've been really struck by a campaign run by Sheffield Trades Council called Sheffield Needs a Pay Rise. Brilliantly run, brilliantly organised, brilliant impact in the community. And that's the issue. Britain needs a pay rise, workers need a pay rise so that they can buy the goods that others produce, that pay the tax, that's bring in the revenue, all the stuff that John was talking about. We have to pick a core issue, take it out to the community and unite and build alliances around those issues. That's the way I think that we not only bring up trade unions, but bring up the working class so that they can fight against the Tory onslaught.
Thanks very much, Cad. And now I don't think there
Sorry, Mary, you asked another thing. Talk
Oh.
about removing the right to strike. Sorry, I forgot about that one.
Oh, go on.
Yes, there was a transport, I think it was in a transport bill that was going to be introduced, and they're talking about stopping rail workers from taking action unless they would cover. I'm sure John could tell you more about it than me. It hasn't been introduced yet. And I don't think it would be introduced in the employment bill, but that's the kind of thing where if you let the TUC off the hook, they'll be that busy fiddling around the edges and doing deals that they'll let go straight through the real danger in a lot of this legislation. And that's what we need to watch out for.
Thanks very much.
Do you want to just add to that, Mary? Yeah, the proposal is that in those essential services, there'll be a minimum service requirement, which we don't know how anybody's going to determine what the minimum service requirement is. But if it means running one train an hour rather than a train every 20 minutes or something like that, I mean, nobody knows what it is, but they do have minimum service requirements in France, for example, on the railways. So that's the proposal. But I have to tell you, if you look at the intricacies of the police crime and sentencing bill, there's provisions in there which allow the police to impose conditions on marches and processions, which are, I forget the phrase now, interrupt the community or people carrying on business. And that is particularly directed where goods or services are time limited, or where there's an interference with goods or services which are essential for the community. So you can see immediately that's going to prevent RMT picketing underground stations if the police decide that they'll be going to be a bit too noisy, or ASDA workers or McDonald's workers picketing McDonald's outlets or supermarkets, because virtually all the goods sold in those supermarkets are time limited, aren't they? So they've got a ready-made argument there. So I think that's going to be a more indirect way of attacking essential services.
Thanks very much. There are no more comments or questions, so I'm going to thank the speakers again and to say that Mark said that we make our own history, but we don't make it in the conditions that we ourselves make. The conditions are made for us, but we can make our own history. And can we learn from our history? Is a the big question that I think that this meeting has thrown up. Two books have been mentioned by CAD, and they are really useful for people who want to find out more about this. There are some more books coming out that actually cover exactly what has been has been talked about today, and that these are books that are actually going to be produced with Marks Memorial Library, a very big history project that's coming out in 6 volumes, but the volumes 4 and 5 cover exactly the period that's been talked about today. And so when those come out, there will be there's going to be a book launch for the first volume, but there'll be a book launch at the library, so you'll all be very welcome to come to that. So let's hope that the period that we're looking at, where the movement was attacked massively, especially after the Tories got in, and frankly, we didn't deal with this situation after 1979. The question is, in what way did the trade unions adapt to that, and did they adapt in the right way? That's the question that we're facing today, because as we know, and as the speakers have said, the capitalist class and their government will always try to smash our movement. The question is whether we are strong enough to resist that. And we will have many more talks on this nature, and our program, our Marks Memorial Library and the Workers' School cover a lot of these issues, which we do need to get our heads around. It's not just a question, I don't think, of slogans, it's a question of practical action and understanding the nature of what actually is class enemy. I think our speakers have really introduced a massively important issue, and they've covered it so well. And I wish we could all let our claps be heard, but thank you very much indeed. Please look at our website. This meeting has been recorded, and all our meetings are recorded, and you can find them on the MML website, and there's lots more there that I think that people will, and there's lots more to come, by the way. Many more things to come. So please look at our website and join in other meetings, but also have a look at our courses as well. Trade unions, class and power cover this sort of thing. We do introduction to Marxism courses, we do women and trade union courses, all sorts. Please have a look and do join us. Thank you very, very much for coming, and particularly thank Carolyn Jones and John Hendy. Thanks very much. Bye, everybody. Okay.